10 hours. That was all it took for Veronica Sloan to chain the gate, storm the driveway, and declare Nolan Mercer's own farm seized before he ever made it home. She stood in his yard with 8 security guards behind her, tearing down his signs and hauling his files into a truck, certain a lone rancher had no way to fight back. What she never knew was that before Nolan drove off that morning, he had sent a single set of coordinates to one man, his oldest friend, a former Marine named Grant Hollis. And when Grant arrived, he did not raise a fist. He raised a hidden camera, a federal land record, and one quiet question that left Veronica with nowhere to hide. If you have ever watched someone in power assume that a quiet man is a weak one, stay with this story to the end and take a second to subscribe, because the moment it turns is one you will want to see coming. Nolan was 42, a former irrigation engineer who had left a steady career in Denver to take over Red Hollow Farm after his uncle passed. He inherited not just 640 acres of Montana grassland, but a set of habits that had kept the place alive through 3 generations. He was a quiet man, more comfortable reading a soil report than arguing in a parking lot, and the people who knew him best said he watched everything twice before he said anything once. Since the day he moved back, he had kept every receipt, every map, every email tied to the farm filed in a steel cabinet against his office wall. Visitors who noticed thought it was excessive. What none of them understood was that Nolan had learned slowly and more than once painfully that a single sheet of paper filed today could be the only thing standing between him and disaster tomorrow. The morning began the way most did. He was up before 6:15, walking the barn, checking the irrigation lines, glancing at the 3 cameras Grant had mounted weeks earlier at the east gate, the equipment shed, and the dirt road down toward the reservoir. For months, letters from the Silvercrest Homeowners Association had arrived demanding that he tear down his wooden fence, repaint his barn in what they called community colors, pay a fee to use an internal road, and let an inspector examine his water system. Nolan had answered every letter in writing, explaining each time that Red Hollow sat on an independent land title recorded years before the subdivision around it existed. Veronica kept sending invoices anyway, until the total climbed past $38,400, a number Nolan understood was never really about money. What the association actually wanted was the narrow road along the eastern edge of his land, the only route wide enough for construction equipment to reach the resort community Veronica intended to build. And that morning, Nolan had to be gone. He had cattle to deliver for inspection nearly 4 hours each way, a trip that would keep him off the farm for almost exactly 10 hours. Before he left, Grant called with a warning. A gray SUV had parked near the gate 2 nights running. Nolan assumed it was someone scouting a hunting lease. Grant did not. He asked Nolan to switch on remote monitoring for every camera before he pulled out of the driveway, and Nolan, who had learned to trust that particular tone in his friend's voice, did exactly that. He went further. He photographed the padlock, the electric meter, the fuel shed, and the ownership certificate hanging in his office, then sealed the survey map and the HOA exemption letter inside the floor safe. It was the same habit that had always felt like overkill, right up until the day it became the difference between winning and losing everything. As his truck disappeared down the county road, a dark sedan parked half a mile off began to move, and the man behind the wheel lifted his phone and called Veronica. She had been waiting for that call for 3 weeks. At 7 minutes past 8, 3 vehicles marked with the Silvercrest emblem rolled to a stop outside Red Hollow Farm. Veronica stepped out and studied the padlock on the gate with the satisfaction of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times. She turned to the men beside her and said that by the time the owner got home, he would not recognize the place he called his own. She had not come alone. Beside her stood Everett Pike, the association's attorney, and Mara Voss, who managed a private security crew along with locksmiths, a tow team, and a technician borrowed from the local power company. Veronica handed Mara a document titled Emergency Property Control Order, which claimed Nolan owed years of unpaid dues, that his water system endangered the community supply, and that his fencing blocked an official evacuation route. When Mara asked whether the sheriff had signed off on any of this, Veronica assured her that Everett had already confirmed the association's right to protect itself. Everett said nothing at all. His silence did the work his conscience would not let his voice do. The locksmiths cut the chain in minutes. One guard climbed a ladder and sprayed paint across the lens of the main camera. Another yanked the power cable from the unit by the shed. Neither of them noticed the fourth camera, a small backup Grant had hidden inside an old electrical box on the fence line, after spotting strange tire tracks 2 weeks before. That lens kept recording steady and unblinking through everything that followed. The crew parked trucks across the driveway, tore down the private property signs, sealed the equipment shed, taped a seizure notice to the front door, dragged Nolan's tractor to the far side of the yard, and planted a new sign that read, "Property managed by Silvercrest Homeowners Association." Inside the house, they worked with the same clinical calm. They pulled open kitchen drawers, unplugged the router in the hallway, and stacked boxes of paperwork by the front door as if the home itself were inventory to be cataloged. One of them took down a framed photograph of Nolan's uncle, the man who had built the barn with his own hands, and set it face down on the counter. It meant nothing to the crew. It would mean everything to Nolan when he finally watched the footage. Outside, the two herding dogs paced the fence line and barked at strangers they did not know until a guard ordered them shut in the barn to keep them out of the way. Then Veronica made her first real mistake. A contractor began driving survey stakes along the eastern road, and Tessa Wren, the county surveyor, was there to see it. She was not passing by on luck. Grant, on his own hunch after seeing that gray SUV, had asked Tessa the day before to run past Red Hollow and confirm the boundary if she had a window, and she had squeezed it into her route. When she checked the fresh stakes against the official survey in her truck, she found they had been set nearly 90 feet off the true line. Veronica pressed her to sign a document confirming the new markers. Tessa refused, and instead of arguing, she quietly photographed every stake, logged the time on each image, and drove away. Minutes later, Everett found something worse. Flipping through the seizure order, he saw his own signature on the bottom, a signature he had never drafted, never approved, and did not remember writing. When he confronted Veronica, she waved it off as an administrative copy, a phrase that did nothing to settle the cold feeling now spreading through him. Because Veronica's real aim was smaller than outright theft and far more clever. She didn't need to keep the farm. She needed Nolan to sign over permanent road access to the reservoir and a promise never to sue the association. Once he signed, the farm would be handed back to him, a hollow gift dressed up as mercy. On the hidden camera, her voice came through clearly as she told Everett that by nightfall, the owner would sign anything just to be let back into his own house. That sentence would later become one of the most damning things anyone said all day. 200 meters out on another ranch, Grant's phone was already lighting up with motion alerts from every device on the property. He pulled up the live feed and watched strangers cut through the gate, watched the truck slide into place across the road, watched Veronica direct all of it like a woman who had walked the choreography in advance. His first instinct as a friend was to drive straight there. His training told him to do the opposite. The number of vehicles, the careful spacing along the road, the handheld camera he could see in one guard's grip, all of it read as a staged ambush, not a spontaneous dispute. So he did not race in. He backed up every second of footage to 3 separate storage locations before he did anything else. Then he started working the phones. He called Tessa, who confirmed the association had deliberately shifted its stakes and tried to make her certify a false boundary. He called the sheriff's office only to learn that Veronica had already phoned ahead, describing a volatile civil dispute and framing Nolan as the unstable party, a story built to make any responding officer suspicious of the wrong man. Grant sent the department everything he had: footage of the locksmiths, the property's official boundary map, and the certificate proving the farm fell outside the association entirely. Then he kept digging through public records until he found the piece that changed the shape of the whole day. Red Hollow was protected under a state agricultural conservation agreement, which meant any change to its roads, water access, or boundaries required approval from a state regulatory office. In one afternoon, Veronica had turned a private quarrel into a possible violation of protected land. Grant's years in the Corps had trained him to read a scene the way most people read a sentence, catching not just what was happening, but what it told him about what came next. He had spent much of his enlistment on security and risk assessment, and the lesson that stuck was this: the most dangerous person in a tense situation is rarely the one shouting. It is the one quietly building the story that everyone else will be forced to accept later. That instinct told him Veronica was not just trying to take a road. She was constructing a version of events designed to survive scrutiny. The only way to beat that was to build a truer version, one nailed down so tightly it could not be argued with. When he finally reached Nolan by phone, his instructions were short. Stay away from the main gate. Do not argue with anyone on the property. Never let your hand touch another person. Switch on audio recording before you get anywhere near the place. Nolan wanted to drive straight home. Grant asked him instead to stop at a gas station 12 miles out and wait, promising to meet him there before either of them went near the farm. It was not only caution. Years earlier, Nolan had helped Grant find steady work after his discharge, and Grant had never forgotten that Red Hollow was not just Nolan's land, but the place that had helped him rebuild his own life when everything else had come apart. He treated the coming confrontation less like a favor and more like a debt. At 4:42 that afternoon, the two men met at the gas station exactly as planned. Grant clipped a small camera to Nolan's shirt, checked that both their phones were recording, and laid out the plan. They would drive in separately. Nolan would approach the gate alone. Grant would hang back at a distance that let him watch the whole scene without being part of it. As Nolan drew closer, he saw the new lock on his fence, the missing private property sign, 8 strangers standing shoulder to shoulder and a truck angled behind him, so he could not simply turn around and leave. For a moment, he just sat behind the wheel, taking in his own driveway, transformed into something he did not recognize, the evening light catching on the guards' vests and the cold new chain wrapped around a gate he had opened by hand nearly every day for a decade. Something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular anger of watching people who had never lifted a shovel on that soil stand as if they owned every inch of it. He forced his hands loose on the wheel and his voice level before he opened the door. Veronica walked out carrying a folder and announced that Red Hollow Farm was now under temporary management by the Homeowners Association. When Nolan asked to see an actual court order, she offered none. She pointed instead to the document bearing Everett's forged signature, while the attorney stood off to the side, unable to meet Nolan's eyes. Her terms were simple. Sign over the road, pay the $38,400, waive any right to sue, and in exchange she would let him collect his belongings from inside his own home. Nolan refused without hesitation. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the idle of engines and the far-off bawl of cattle in the north pasture. Veronica studied his face for the crack she had been promised would appear, and when it did not come, she tried a softer voice. This could all be over in 10 minutes, she said, if he just signed where she pointed. His neighbors were watching. Resistance would only make him look unreasonable. Nolan answered that he had read every letter she had sent him for months, and not one of them had ever come from a court, a fact that mattered more to him standing on his own land than any deadline she tried to invent. Then he did something Grant had not scripted. Instead of waiting to be told to leave, Nolan reached into his jacket, took out his own copies of the ownership certificate and the conservation agreement and held them up so both cameras and every guard could see them. He read the case reference on the conservation agreement aloud, slowly, and asked the guards a simple question. Did any of them want to be the one who moved protected state property on the strength of a paper Veronica had signed for herself? 2 of the guards looked at each other. It was the first time all day that anyone on her crew had been given a reason to stop and think. At Veronica's signal, 2 guards stepped forward anyway and ordered Nolan off what they called association-controlled property. When he asked exactly what authority permitted that order, Mara could only reread the same vague language from the folder, unable to name a single court or agency behind it. Nolan pointed out that the association had no power to seize land beyond its own boundaries, and when Veronica claimed a new map placed his farm inside those boundaries, he understood at once that the stakes had been moved. A guard reached for his truck door. Nolan simply locked it, kept both hands on the wheel in plain view, and refused to give anyone a reason to say he had resisted. Veronica raised her voice for her own camera, declaring that Nolan was obstructing association personnel and placed a call claiming he had tried to force his way into a restricted area. From a distance, Grant recorded all of it, and he waited. He waited until the tow team moved to hitch Nolan's truck before he finally stepped forward in plain work clothes, carrying no weapon, no badge, and using no raised voice. Veronica mocked him as the soldier friend Nolan had called in to intimidate her crew. Grant only asked calmly and again who had signed the order, which court had issued it, who had authorized the locksmiths, and who had given permission to move private property. No one on her team could answer with any confidence. Mara stood a few feet back through most of it, arms crossed, watching her own crew grow visibly uncertain about orders that no longer sounded like anything she had trained to enforce. She had taken the contract believing she was securing a neglected parcel for a legitimate community board, not helping force a man out of a home he legally owned, and the distance between those two things widened with every question Veronica could not answer. Grant nodded toward the old electrical box on the fence line where a small light on the hidden camera blinked steadily, and something in Veronica's face shifted the moment she understood what that light meant. Sirens sounded from the far end of the road, and she smiled, certain the officers had come to arrest Nolan on her word. Grant only looked at her and said she had better hope they had come for nothing more than the call she had placed. 2 patrol cars arrived with Sheriff Alden Rowe. Veronica moved quickly to intercept him, insisting the association was enforcing an emergency order, that Nolan had threatened her staff and that the former Marine had been brought in to intimidate her crew. When the sheriff asked whether Nolan was armed, he stepped out of the truck with both hands raised and answered plainly that he was not, while Grant handed over a tablet loaded with footage instead of arguing his case in words. The first clip showed the locksmiths cutting the chain while Nolan was still hours away. The second showed Veronica ordering a camera covered. The third caught her telling Everett the owner would sign anything just to reach his own front door. Veronica insisted the footage was edited. But when Sheriff Rowe turned to Everett and asked directly whether the signature on the seizure order was his, the attorney could only say it resembled his handwriting, stopping just short of confirming the forgery. Unwilling yet to treat the matter as anything more than a civil dispute, the sheriff asked both sides to keep their distance, and Veronica seized on the hesitation, claiming Nolan had violated her fabricated order and demanding he be restrained on the spot. Nolan stayed composed, even as the humiliation of standing cuffed on his own land pressed down on him, and Grant asked the sheriff to call the county records office and verify the order's case number. The number once checked did not exist anywhere in the system. By now, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered along the road drawn by the flashing lights and the sight of a farmer standing with his hands raised on his own property. Their presence was a pressure Veronica had not planned for, because every version of her story now had witnesses who were not on her payroll. One woman filmed quietly on her own phone and murmured to another that this did not look like any lawful eviction she had ever seen. The sheriff, aware the moment was no longer contained to a handful of people he could manage, grew more careful with every claim. Then Everett's hands began to shake. Searching his email, he found a message in which Veronica had told her assistant to pull a sample of his signature from an old contract, and he realized he had been made into a tool without ever agreeing to it. Mara overheard and asked Veronica outright whether her team had just spent a full day enforcing a forged document. When Veronica snapped at her to hold the line, Mara refused to lay a hand on Nolan for another second. Sheriff Rowe ordered every guard to stand down. Veronica pushed forward with one last claim, producing a newer map that placed the eastern road inside association territory until Tessa arrived with the county's official survey and confirmed the boundary had been shifted by nearly 90 feet. Veronica accused her of favoring Nolan. Grant pointed out that Tessa's coordinates had been officially stamped weeks before the dispute began, and by then the sheriff had stopped treating the day as a simple disagreement between neighbors. The most damaging discovery still waited inside a locked truck at the edge of the driveway. Grant's footage showed a guard carrying a heavy filing safe out of Nolan's office and loading it into that vehicle. When Sheriff Rowe moved to have the truck opened, Veronica stepped in front of it and announced that no one could search association property without a warrant. Nolan answered simply that the truck might belong to her, but everything inside it belonged to him. Grant replayed the footage from the moment the safe left the office to the moment it went into the truck, clear enough that Mara identified the guard as one of her own men. That guard admitted Veronica had told him the safe held documents belonging to the association, and when she spun around and threatened to fire him for saying so, the sheriff read that reaction for exactly what it was. When the truck was finally opened, it held Nolan's safe, the stolen private property sign, the cut remains of his original padlock, 2 boxes of tax records, a router torn from his camera system, and a folder that had nothing to do with him at all. Nolan opened his own safe with the combination only he knew and found his ownership certificate, boundary survey, conservation agreement, and water records exactly where he had left them. The unfamiliar folder turned out to be Veronica's, and Grant recognized it at once as a full development plan for what she called Silver Crest East, a proposal already advertising 86 new lots, though the association had never secured legal access to the road required to build them. Investors, it turned out, had been promised the route through Red Hollow would open within 30 days, a promise that could not be kept without Nolan's land, which explained exactly why Veronica had needed his signature that same afternoon and not a day later. Toward the back of the folder, Grant found a glossy brochure meant for buyers, complete with an artist's rendering of a paved entrance running directly through Nolan's own pasture, framed by trees that did not exist, and topped with a welcome sign bearing a name the land had never worn. Sheriff Rowe studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Veronica and asked how she had planned to explain a road through private property to a bank underwriting 86 home loans. She didn't answer. Everett finally admitted he had only been hired to draft a negotiation proposal, never a seizure order, and that his signature had been copied without his knowledge. Veronica blamed an assistant who had never been given such instructions. Grant asked the sheriff to preserve Veronica's phone, the association's computers, its internal email, and every second of footage before anything could be altered, and at that exact moment, Veronica quietly sent a message to a board member asking that the project folder be deleted. Grant saw it appear on her screen and reported it immediately. The sheriff ordered her to set the phone down. She ignored him until Mara stepped away from the group entirely and announced that her security team would no longer work on behalf of the association. What Veronica did not know was that Grant's camera system mirrored its footage to a remote server run by the farm's insurance provider whenever it detected tampering. Nothing she deleted could actually disappear. A county investigator soon confirmed the association's email server had already been preserved under an emergency request, and buried in the project folder was a single subject line that read, "In full, the 10-hour campaign force, Mercer to sign before dark." The investigator read through 3 weeks of internal messages showing Veronica had tracked Nolan's cattle schedule closely enough to know the exact day he would be gone for roughly 10 hours. Her plan had 4 stages: move security onto the property while he was away, change the locks and strip anything useful from his office, wait for his return, provoke a visible outburst on camera, then use that footage to request a restraining order that would push him to sign the road agreement out of sheer exhaustion. One email told her staff to provoke Nolan without ever striking first in view of the main camera, a plan built entirely around a blind spot that never accounted for the hidden unit on the fence. In one message, Veronica had written that the owner of Red Hollow was, in her words, too sentimental about a piece of dirt to fight back the way a real business would. That sentence landed harder on Nolan than almost anything else that day. He said nothing. He only looked toward the barn his uncle had built, and in that silence Grant recognized something he had seen before in men who had been badly underestimated by people who mistook quiet for weakness. Everett read the messages carrying his forged name and told the investigator he would cooperate fully, a decision that clearly unsettled Veronica, even as she kept insisting she had acted in the interest of the association's 214 homeowners. Nolan reminded her that none of those homeowners had ever voted on a plan to seize his farm. When Grant requested the official meeting minutes, they showed no mention of Red Hollow at all, confirming Veronica had run the entire operation through a private message thread outside any formal board process. 2 board members arrived and confirmed under questioning that they had never approved a single step of what happened that day. Veronica finally admitted the truth behind her urgency. The association had borrowed heavily against the expansion, and without guaranteed access to the eastern road, the loan would be called in immediately. When Nolan asked why she had never pursued a lawful negotiation, she claimed he had rejected her first offer outright. He clarified that he had only rejected a route cutting through his reservoir and protected wetland, never every possible agreement. Grant added that an alternate road bypassing the reservoir would have cost the association nearly $1.8 million more, a price Veronica had chosen to avoid by trying to take the land instead of admitting her original plan had been flawed from the start. Sheriff Rowe told Veronica she was now under investigation for trespassing, theft of property, document forgery, obstruction, and conspiracy to coerce a landowner, a list that made simply walking away impossible. She turned to Grant and accused him of orchestrating the whole confrontation out of a personal grudge. He replied that he had created none of her actions. He had only made sure she could never rewrite them. As the sun dropped behind the fields, the sheriff asked her to place both hands forward, and before she was led away, she turned back to Nolan with a final warning that he might win today, but tomorrow the whole neighborhood would take him to court. That warning proved partly true, though not the way she meant. Silvercrest held an emergency session and suspended her from the board. Yet the association still faced the loan, its contractor agreements, and the very real threat of lawsuits from investors who had already put money into lots that might never be built. Several residents, angry and convinced their property values were about to fall, sent Nolan threatening letters of their own. Grant advised him not to argue in public, but to release his evidence in a controlled, deliberate way through legal channels rather than emotion, and Nolan listened. The hearing drew a larger crowd than the small county courtroom, usually saw a mix of Silvercrest residents anxious about their investments, reporters following the unusual case of an association accused of seizing land outside its own boundaries, and a handful of neighboring farmers who had quietly weathered their own disputes with the association and had never seen anyone push back with this much evidence behind them. Nolan hired a land use attorney and filed for a restraining order barring the association from his property, along with a request for the return of his belongings, compensation for damages, and preservation of every internal record. Judge Celeste Rowan opened by reminding everyone that her only concern was the law as written, not the reputation of either party. The association's temporary counsel argued that Veronica had acted entirely on her own, separate from any official authority. Nolan's attorney answered with the association's own vehicles, its own paid staff, its own budget, and its own signed security contract, all of it traceable to funds the board itself had approved. Tessa testified about the falsified stakes. Everett testified about the forged signature. Mara confirmed that Veronica had privately called the whole operation a takeover rather than an inspection. Grant presented his timeline of footage without exaggerating his own part, and when the judge asked why he had not simply intervened the moment he arrived, explained that his goal had always been to protect Nolan, not to manufacture a second confrontation, because chaos was exactly what Veronica needed the cameras to capture. Calm evidence gathered patiently had done more damage to her plan than any fight ever could. Nolan sat through most of the hearing in silence, speaking only when questioned. When the association's counsel suggested his refusal to negotiate had forced the escalation, he answered simply that a man cannot be blamed for declining to sign away his own property under threat, no matter how neatly the threat is dressed up in paperwork. Veronica arrived with a private attorney and claimed the board had made her a scapegoat for decisions everyone had quietly supported. But prosecutors produced the message in which she had personally ordered the deletion of internal files, and her claim of innocence collapsed in an instant. Judge Rowan ruled that the association had committed a serious violation of Nolan's property rights. She issued a restraining order, barring further contact, a mandate to restore the gate and return the stolen property, a freeze on the entire Silvercrest East development, and an order for an independent financial audit of the association's accounts. Just as Nolan believed the ordeal was winding down, the audit uncovered that $620,000 had vanished from the project's funds, every transfer personally approved by Veronica. Auditors traced payments to a consulting firm, controlled by someone close to her, found association money spent tracking Nolan's movements before the seizure, uncovered a high-risk loan clause deliberately hidden from the board, and confirmed a special assessment fee charged to residents without any legitimate vote. The expansion had relied not only on Nolan's stolen road, but on inflated sales figures that never reflected genuine buyer interest. And once the bank suspended the loan and investors withdrew one after another, residents across Silvercrest began to understand that Nolan had never been the source of their crisis. He was only the man who had kept it from growing worse. The same neighbors who had instinctively sided with their president now questioned every assessment fee they had paid, every glossy newsletter promising rising values, every meeting where questions about the expansion had been quietly redirected. Some longtime residents admitted in conversations later relayed to Nolan that they had always found Veronica's confidence reassuring, mistaking certainty for competence in a way that had left the board's oversight far thinner than anyone realized until it was too late. A group of neighbors eventually came to the farm to apologize. Rather than use the moment for satisfaction, Nolan agreed to attend a public meeting on the condition that Veronica be excluded, that every document be made available, and that any resident could ask a direct question. At that meeting, Grant offered a brief factual account of the timeline, and Nolan explained why the reservoir mattered so much, how it served the farm, protected the surrounding wetland, and reduced fire risk in a way that could never be safely divided by a construction road. Tessa proposed an alternate route entirely off Nolan's land, more expensive but fully legal, and the newly reformed board accepted it rather than pour more debt into a project already in ruins. Silvercrest sold off the undeveloped parcels to cover its loan. Veronica was formally charged based on the documents and digital evidence gathered throughout the investigation. Mara received partial immunity in exchange for her cooperation and her willingness to confirm exactly whose orders her team had been following, while Everett faced professional discipline for his prolonged silence, even though he had never forged anything himself. Nolan was awarded compensation for repairs, damages, and legal costs, along with a civil penalty tied to the association's deliberate trespass, and Red Hollow Farm was formally and permanently confirmed to sit outside the reach of any homeowners association, its gate rebuilt and its private property sign returned to the exact spot where it had always belonged. At one point, Nolan asked Grant how he had been so sure the plan would fail. Grant answered that Veronica had made the mistake nearly everyone makes who confuses authority with power. She had spent weeks preparing for how Nolan might react and never once prepared for the possibility that he simply would not react the way she needed. Later, Nolan handed Grant the old cut padlock, a quiet reminder of the day the farm had nearly been taken. Grant studied it a moment, then said it had never been the lock that protected the place. It had been the evidence. 6 months later, Red Hollow was running smoothly again. Its eastern gate repaired its barn, restocked its office, reorganized its camera network, fully restored. Nolan chose not to wall himself off from the world. He invested in the opposite off-site footage, storage, digitized land records, automated alerts, and a clear list of emergency contacts any neighbor could reach if trouble ever came again. Grant started a free monthly workshop for older farmers and independent landowners, teaching them to verify property boundaries, keep organized records, recognize fraudulent penalty notices, and handle conflict without stepping into the kind of trap that had nearly cost Nolan everything. Nolan gave over a corner of his equipment shed as the workshop's permanent home. The first session drew 11 landowners, several of them elderly, several managing land that had been in their families for generations, all of them arriving with a version of the same worry Nolan had once carried alone. By the third month, word had spread well beyond Silvercrest, and landowners from 3 neighboring counties were making the drive to sit in the same shed where Nolan's tractor had once been dragged away against his will. Tessa began leading sessions on reading survey maps and understanding land use rights. The newly restructured Silvercrest board adopted stricter rules requiring resident votes on any major project, banning any single president from signing security contracts alone, and mandating that financial records be published every quarter for anyone to review. The association was not dissolved, only rebuilt with real oversight. And that distinction mattered because the failure had never been the existence of the organization. It had been the unchecked power one person was allowed to hold inside it. Veronica's sentence included jail time, full restitution, and a permanent ban from ever holding a leadership position in any community organization again. And with the evidence rooted entirely in her own actions, she had no one left to blame. Standing at the rebuilt gate one afternoon, Nolan admitted to Grant that the moment he first saw a stranger in his yard, every instinct in his body had wanted to drive straight through the barricade. Grant told him that the restraint he showed in that moment was exactly what had kept him from walking into the trap built for him. Nolan thanked him for ending the ambush, but Grant corrected him gently. He had done nothing more than recognize the trap for what it was. It was Nolan who had refused to walk into it. The 2 men looked out toward the eastern road where the false stakes had long since been pulled from the ground, and as the gate swung open, Nolan drove back onto his own land without needing anyone's permission at all. Some evenings he still walked that road alone after the work was done, past the spot where the false stakes had stood, past the fence line where a hidden camera had quietly recorded the truth while everyone assumed it had been silenced with the rest. He thought more than once about how easily it could have gone the other way had he answered. Anger with anger had Grant not trusted his training over his instinct to rush in. Had a single camera not been tucked inside an old electrical box nobody thought to check. Red Hollow had not been saved by force or threats or vengeance thrown in the heat of the moment. It had been saved by preparation, by patience, and by a friend who understood that the most important battle is sometimes the one where you never give your opponent the chance to make you look like the one at fault. Veronica had spent 10 hours building what she believed was a flawless ambush. Grant needed only a few minutes to prove that every step of it had been recorded from the very beginning. Power alone could break a lock, tear down a sign, and surround a house. But once the truth stood protected by evidence, not even the most determined authority could claim ownership of something that had never truly belonged to it. If this story held you to the end, do 2 quick things before you go. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and tell me in the comments what you would have done the moment you saw strangers standing in your own yard. Would you have stayed as calm as Nolan or driven straight through the gate? I read every answer.